Ghost flights, a lucrative secret in the aviation industry that few know about. Qatar Airways has been flying near empty and sometimes entirely empty large passenger jets every day between Melbourne and Adelaide to exploit a loophole, allowing it to run extra flights to Australia. What is the purpose? In fact, they want to exploit a loophole, a gap in the aviation system, which allows this airline to operate more flights to the land of kangaroos. Qatar's ghost flights, an open secret within the aviation sector, are taking the piss out of Australia's strict aviation laws, industry sources say, and are occurring despite the Albanese government rejecting the airline's formal request to increase flights out of concern the extra capacity would go against Australia's national interests. The Qatari government-owned airline is currently limited to running 28 weekly services into Australia's 4 major airports, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Perth, allowing it to run once daily return flights from Doha into each of these cities. However, under the existing bilateral agreement, there is no limit placed on how many services Qatar is able to run to non-major airports. In November 2022, Qatar Airways introduced a second daily, non-stop flight between Doha and Melbourne, but with Adelaide registered as its destination and departure port in Australia. By flying the 354-seater Boeing 777-300ERs between Melbourne and Adelaide, it means the airline does not exceed the 28 weekly services into major airports it is allowed to operate under the existing bilateral agreement. Typically, the majority of passengers only travel between Doha and Melbourne, with very few continuing on to the final destination of Adelaide. However, Qatar Airways is willing to fly an additional short segment. Their main purpose is to fully exploit the flight route between Doha and Melbourne. The situation becomes more complex as Qatar Airways is unable to sell tickets for domestic travel from Melbourne to Adelaide, according to Australian authorities' regulations. The airline can only carry a small number of international passengers who have booked tickets from Doha, transited through Melbourne, and are destined for Adelaide. Additionally, the airline also offers direct flights between Adelaide and Doha. Qatar's QR988 arrives from Doha into Melbourne at 11:30 p.m. each night, and almost all passengers disembark. However, any passengers booked to stay on the plane for the Adelaide leg must endure a 6-hour layover in Tullamarine Airport's International Terminal before the flight departs at 5:35 a.m. because of Adelaide Airport's 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew. The QR989, which flies the outbound direction to Doha, departs Adelaide at 11:40 a.m. each day, lands in Melbourne 1 hour 30 minutes later, and travelers have a shorter 1 hour 45 minutes layover in the international terminal before the majority of passengers board the non-stop flight to Doha. According to The Guardian, passenger numbers on the 354-seat aircraft average in the single digits on the inbound QR988 leg from Melbourne to Adelaide, with the overnight layover. According to Guardian analysis of government flight data and confirmed by sources with knowledge of the flights, this flight sometimes carries no passengers at all. The outbound QR989 Adelaide to Melbourne service has proved slightly more popular with travelers to Adelaide. There are between 20 and 35 passengers on this flight on average, according to the analysis. Flights that operate with less than 10% capacity utilization and do not generate profits are referred to as ghost flights. This is a way to circumvent regulations rather than concealing a mystical story. Usually, to travel between Doha and Adelaide, passengers have the option to choose a direct flight between these two segments, part of the Doha-Auckland route provided by Qatar Airways. In addition, Qatar Airways is also operating a daily service on Mondays between Doha and Sydney. contrary to the regulation allowing only one daily flight service to Sydney. However, Qatar Airways has managed this by utilizing a similar regulatory workaround, extending the final destination to the capital city, Canberra. While flights with a secondary port can encourage global airlines to better serve smaller cities in Australia, the scheduling of QR988 and QR989 have led to a view within the aviation sector that they are primarily functioning as secondary Melbourne services, multiple sources say. Such was the case that when Qatar Airways launched the flights in November, it was not selling tickets on the Melbourne-Adelaide legs to international passengers for the initial weeks of the service. The overnight layover was originally more than 11 hours. Frustrated by Qatar exploiting the loophole, the Department of Infrastructure and Transport placed a condition on the timetable approval for these flights on this route that they must be available for sale for passengers and cargo arriving and departing from Adelaide, the spokesperson for the Transport Minister, Catherine King, said. The department now continuously monitored Qatar Airways sales to ensure this condition is being met by the airline, the spokesperson said. An industry source said the whole purpose is to get to Melbourne. They weren't even selling tickets to Adelaide for the first few weeks. They were taking the piss out of the industry and the laws. The extra flights will be allowed to continue even after the Albanese government rejected Qatar Airways' push to fly an additional 21 services into major airports, something supported by most in the aviation and tourism industries, as well as state premiers, after taking into account all national interest considerations. According to The Guardian on August 8th, Qatar Airways is currently not responding to requests for comments regarding the ghost flights. Ghost flights are not a unique phenomenon occurring solely with Qatar Airways or in Australia. In the early days of the pandemic, when demand for air travel abruptly flatlined and international borders closed, ghost flights became a common thing. These were empty or near-empty planes traversing the skyline as airline schedules kept to their contractual obligations to fly. The problem is that more than 2 years on, they're still haunting the skies above us. A new report by The Guardian, based on a Freedom of Information request, found that at the end of last year, there were around 500 ghost flights departing from the UK per month. And in January 2022, analysts from Greenpeace claimed that more than 100,000 ghost flights would sail over European skies this winter. The climate damage, claims the environmental group, is equivalent to the yearly emissions of more than 1.4 million cars. The Greenpeace figures were extrapolated from a December interview with Lufthansa CEO Carsten Spohr, in which he warned that Lufthansa Group was facing the prospect of 18,000 superfluous flights over the 6-month winter season to retain its slots under European rules. On the basis that Lufthansa's air traffic accounts for 17% of the European market, Greenpeace reckons the total number of Europe's ghost flights would generate 2.1 million tons of CO2. The analysis has triggered a torrent of outrage. Campaigner Greta Thunberg asserted that Brussels Airlines, part of the Lufthansa Group, makes 3,000 unnecessary flights to maintain airport slots. In the UK, a petition was launched appealing to the government to ground unoccupied flights. Lufthansa, meanwhile, says it's doing its best to fill all its aircraft, but was struggling to balance COVID chaos with the need to hold on to its slots. Unnecessary flights are not empty or ghost flights, a spokesman for the airline told CNN. They are scheduled flights that are poorly booked due to the pandemic. Despite poor demand, Lufthansa Group airlines must operate these flights to continue securing takeoff and landing rights at hubs and major EU airports. The reason airlines continue to operate these expensive flights is because the industry is engaged in a slots game more high stakes and lucrative than anything you'll find in Las Vegas. Even when passengers are staying away, airlines still need to protect their slots, their scheduled time on valuable routes. For any airline, ensuring access to busy routes is of utmost importance. Slots are extremely precious assets for airlines, with more than 200 of the planet's busiest hubs operating at full capacity. Demand for flights exceeds the availability of runways and space inside the terminals. To manage this capacity at congested airports is segmented into slots. These are the facility to land, disembark passengers, refuel, take on a new cohort of passengers, and then take off again, all within a specified and regulated time frame. Carriers then plan their schedules based on slot availability at both ends of the route. To maximize revenue, the schedules have to align with demand. Early morning slots for business travelers traveling short-haul, same-day return trips are highly prized. But synchronizing the timing of both ends of the journey when the most desirable airports, such as London Heathrow and New York JFK, are full up is no easy feat. If you take off from one place, you need to know you can land at a certain time at another, says Paul Steele of the IATA. If you tinker with slot allocation at one end of the process, it creates chaos at the other end, and therefore we need a harmonized system. That's where the Worldwide Airport Slot Guidelines, or WASG, come in. These are the foundation upon which the global slot allocation process works. The guidelines, jointly published by IATA, Airports Council International, and the Worldwide Airport Coordinators Group, aspire to deliver transparency, flexibility, certainty, consistency, and sustainability for the benefit of airlines, airports, and consumers. In the meantime, there's a rule that states that if an airline successfully uses its slot at least 80% of the time, it is allowed to retain the slot the following season, a system known as grandfather rights. In the UK, Heathrow Airport holds the most valuable slots. Limited capacity there has propelled the price of slots skywards, with an early morning slot pair worth around $19 million, falling to $13 million at midday and $6 million in the evening, according to a UK House of Commons briefing paper. Record-breaking deals where airlines have traded these slots include the case of Oman Air, which was reported to have paid $75 million for a pair of takeoff and landing slots at Heathrow in early 2016. In March 2017, SAS Scandinavian Airlines sold 2 slot pairs at Heathrow to American Airlines for $75 million, according to the same paper. If you ever land at London's Heathrow Airport, you'll be astonished by the immense number of passengers at one of the world's busiest airports. This leads to airlines not being able to simply park at Heathrow whenever they want. They must purchase slot pairs for landing and takeoff. These slots are extremely expensive yet always in high demand because there are only 650 slot pairs available each day. This has prompted some airlines to operate ghost flights, where they take off and land without carrying passengers solely to maintain their slots. However, since 2020, with the pandemic severely impacting air travel demand, the 80% slot usage rule has been relaxed. Nevertheless, to this day, ghost flights continue in various unpredictable forms, such as Qatar Airways flights to Australia, utilizing on regulatory loopholes. And with this, the World Affairs for today comes to a close. Thank you for following along. Goodbye for now, and see you again.